it's my distinct pleasure to be moderating this excellent panel. Let me just say a few words to motivate the panel why this is so important to me and I think to our center. I think there's a widespread feeling that liberalism and liberal democracy are going through a rough patch. A lot of data support that. Across the industrialized world, there's a huge amount of polarization. Trust in institutions is at an all-time low. There is very little bipartisanship, and even worse, support for democracy has reached an all-time low across many countries, especially among young people, especially in the United States and the UK. And these are topics I have spent a lot of time thinking. I have a new book coming up which was entitled Remaking Liberalism. Josh knows it very well. Now it's entitled What Happened to Liberal Democracy. But I cannot imagine a better panel to wade into these issues. You know, my argument, which I think will have some support from this panel, is that liberalism still has the best ideas, but it has committed sins of omission and sins of commission. Sins of omissions being not dealing with problems of shared prosperity, not dealing with declining quality of public services, and lack of voice, and perhaps commission being sort of underpinning a greater polarization in society with a gap between the more educated who have become very influential in politics and the less educated, the working classes falling behind, so adding another dimension of inequality. But that's enough about my views, because I think there are more interesting ones coming through, and this panel is fantastic. So we're going to have it in a conversational manner, but let me first, for that reason, introduce all three of the speakers. To my immediate left is Josh Cohen, who is no stranger to MIT. He was our colleague for a number of years, and now Josh is doing his wonderful political philosophy and broader commentary on democracy at Apple University. And he's also a distinguished senior fellow in law, philosophy, and political science at Berkeley since 2014. And he's also taught at Stanford. And very importantly, Josh has been tireless as the editor of Boston Review, which has emerged as a wonderful publication. So thanks for all of those services. Marc Dunkelman is senior fellow at Searchlight Institute, a fellow at Brown University's Watson School for International and Public Affairs, and a former fellow at NYU's Moran Institute for Urban Management. And he's been involved both in thought leadership and politics, and very relevant, we'll see that. He's the author most recently of Why Nothing Works, which is part of what we were just talking about. And Helena Rosenblatt is Distinguished Professor of History, Political Science, and French at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And another very influential book on me, and I think on these issues, is A Lost History of Liberalism from Ancient Rome to the 21st Century. And she's also written on other political philosophers of the liberal type, Rousseau, Benjamin Constant, and others. And she served on many, many important public roles, and I think we're going to benefit a lot from this very diverse but informed group. So I'm going to start with Josh, and I think that's a good place to start from my point of view, because I think Josh also shares my view that there is a liberalism failure, and he has argued that is related to what the outcomes that liberalism has delivered or have failed to deliver, and has called for a more populist liberalism. What do you mean by that, and how can you defend that in light of liberalism general meaning?
It's such a good question, Daron, that I wrote out an answer to it in advance. But before getting to the question, I just wanted to take a moment to congratulate you and David and Simon on the opening of this center. It's a recognition of the contributions that the three of you have made to public discussion, as David said, about fundamental issues of contemporary politics and economics. And I think everybody here owes you a great deal for those contributions. Also a lot to the affiliates of the center, to James and Kathleen Stone for supporting this effort, and also to MIT for being a home over the generations for work of this kind of public importance. Of course, with this gratitude comes great expectations. As you said, it's a dangerous time, and we need this center to succeed in helping us both understand more deeply and act with more thoughtful resolve on the topics that the center is called to address. And those are the three topics for today: the challenge of wealth inequality for shared prosperity, the challenges of new technologies for the future of good jobs, and our topic for this session, the challenge of both for the sustainability of liberal democracy. So turning to the topic, the title of our session is Reinventing Liberalism in a Populist Era. So let me start by saying how I think about liberalism. So some people think of liberalism as a kind of general outlook on life, a philosophy of life, maybe a broad-minded sensibility. You find this in a 1941 poem by Robert Frost, who defined a liberal as someone who's too broad-minded to take his own side in a quarrel. Or maybe it's not broad-mindedness, but the importance of choosing our own path or of autonomy. And on all of these views, whether it's broad-mindedness or choice or autonomy, liberalism is, and here I borrow a term from John Rawls, it's a comprehensive outlook on all of life, a guide to all action and all relationships. And liberal political ideas are just the application of that comprehensive outlook to the department of politics. So I think we should resist those views and think of liberalism in a specifically political register. Liberalism, thus understood, as I interpret it, has four main commitments. First, to basic political and personal liberties as having some kind of priority. Secondly, to fair opportunities for all. Third, to shared prosperity with decent levels of resources for making use of those opportunities. And fourth, to the idea that when it comes to law and policy, each person's life matters equally. Understood that way, liberalism is a kind of a thin view, and in two ways, both of which are, I think, virtues because they make liberalism more pluralistic. And let me explain the two ways. First, as we all know, there are secular liberals, Catholic liberals, Muslim liberals, Jewish liberals, Hindu liberals. Of course, not all secularists or Catholics or Muslims or Hindus or Jews are liberals, but those conflicting, comprehensive outlooks can each be interpreted in a way that supports liberalism as I've defined it as a political outlook. And by emphasizing the plurality of paths to liberalism, the thin conception, political conception of liberalism has, I think, a powerful practical virtue. So think of liberalism as a set of ideas that are supposed to provide the basis for political argument. If we understand it that way, then we don't want to impose hurdles to joining public discussion by making it an exclusive club. If we understand liberalism as a comprehensive outlook owned by secular liberals in the Millian tradition, say, then we establish precisely those hurdles. So keep our ideas about liberalism more minimal, focused on ideas that can be shared by people who disagree profoundly about life's ultimate questions. The interpretation of liberalism is thin in a second way. The four ideas that I mentioned about liberties, about equality, opportunity, about shared prosperity, and about equality, they're open to very different interpretations, from classical liberalism to more social democratic liberalism. Some interpretations of shared prosperity, for example, probably shared by us, have a more egalitarian view of fair distribution, which other liberalisms reject. That captures the reality of liberalism, that there are many. In Capitalism and Freedom, Milton Friedman said, equality comes sharply into conflict with freedom. One must choose. One cannot be both an egalitarian and a liberal. I think that's a profoundly sectarian misconception of liberalism. And appreciating this plurality of liberalisms connects powerfully with how to think about tensions between liberalism and populism. People who understand liberalism as thinner, as more open to variety, as more inclusive, will be less inclined to dismiss populism as somehow intrinsically hostile to liberalism, which is, I think, a disastrous and unforced error. In the United States, since the People's Party, the populist impulse is in part a matter of righteous anger, not status anxiety, but righteous anger directed precisely against failures to deliver on promises of opportunity and shared prosperity. Populists direct that anger at elites, especially political, cultural, and intellectual elites, because they repeatedly made those promises and failed repeatedly to deliver on them and provided repeated excuses for the failures. These are powerful complaints, even if they're not always taken in constructive directions. So thinking about liberalism in the way I have described, not as a comprehensive moral outlook or a cultural sensibility, but a political framework, opens a space for real engagement with populism, which has historically been a source of some of the central ideas about the shame of inequality and the dignity of work that animate this center. That's how I understand one of the central tasks of reinventing liberalism in a populist era.
Thank you, Josh. That's fantastic. We'll come back to some of these themes in the second round, but now I'm moving to Marc, I think who shares your and my sort of focus on left liberalism and why nothing works. Marc has identified these two impulses, Jeffersonian and Hamiltonian, and he'll explain them, but I'm not going to paraphrase it. But I think the conclusion that follows is that you're quite optimistic, even more optimistic than Josh, that the current crisis is just an episodic one, and with the right balancing of the Jeffersonian bottom-up impulses and the Hamiltonian top-down try to improve things for the masses impulses, we can have a vibrant liberalism.
Yeah. So, first of all, I want to share Josh's appreciation of this terrific center, and I'm so grateful to be able to be part of this event. About a decade ago, I was taking the train into New York City and reading The Power Broker, which I don't know how many people here will have read. Here's someone who's read it. Many more of you will have it on your shelf just to show off. It's 1,500 pages and very dense, beautifully written. And it's about the most important man, the most powerful man in New York City from the 1930s to the 1960s, Robert Moses, who with sort of a wave of his hand could build highways and housing projects and whatnot. There's a chapter in it called 1 Mile, which is particularly powerful about him building the Cross Bronx Expressway through a series of working class neighborhoods with everyone screaming at him not to do it or do a different route or do something else, and he didn't care, he had so much power. And I was reading this book, or rereading it, I wouldn't brag to say, as I came into Penn Station, which is the world's second most heavily trafficked transit hub. And as anyone here who's taken the train to New York City knows, it's a rat's nest. It is just disgusting. And the question in my mind as I was pulling out of the train was, how is it that 50 years ago in the 1950s, Robert Moses was able to do this huge project with everyone screaming no, and now we have this incredibly important piece of public infrastructure that everyone wants to improve and we can't get anything done. And so that was like a decade, 12 years ago, and I didn't have a good answer. I thought as a Knicks fan, this has got to be the Dolans who did this. But it turned out that as I researched it for several years, that the Dolans were not particularly helpful, but they weren't really the problem. The problem was that if you looked across the whole spectrum of people who had vested interests in that little bit of Manhattan, the state, the city, Amtrak, the Long Island Railroad, Vornado, which owns a lot of the nearby real estate, the Dolans who own Madison Square Garden, all of these different interests, They all had slightly different variations of what they wanted to be done and how it should be done, and there was no powerful interest that could resolve their differences. And so the project just stood dormant for decade upon decade. And I began to wonder whether that was some sort of parable for what had happened more broadly to liberalism. And what I came to conclude after another 5 years of research was that if you look back at the liberal tradition, it's got two sort of strange and countervailing impulses within it. One, which I call the Hamiltonian impulse, is what we as liberals would want to apply to a tragedy of the common. There's no good sewer system in the neighborhood. There's no good schools, whatever it is. Some problem that we as individuals can't solve for ourselves. And when we can't solve it for ourselves, what we need to do is we need to collect our power and push it up into some institution that will solve it for us. That big institution will build the highway, will whatever. It's a big Hamiltonian institution because that's what Alexander Hamilton had wanted, a big, powerful, centralized institution. Sort of the classic example, maybe the best example in America, is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which took an area that's roughly the size of England and which was impoverished in the 1930s and turned it into a vibrant region of the country. The second example, though, is the second story we have, which is the Jeffersonian story, is that there is some power above us that is stealing our own autonomy, that is telling us what to do when we don't like it. And we want to push that power and push it back down to individuals who are being coerced by the man, by the establishment. In our present day, we both, as liberals, are prone in the context of climate change to want to push power up in a Hamiltonian sense into institutions that will tell carbon emitters to stop, because we can't do that on our own. And we are prone to push reproductive rights back down to women so that some bureaucrat doesn't tell them what they can do with their bodies. And over the course of the history of progressivism, these two warring impulses have played against each other in a yin and yang kind of fashion for the whole of our history. For the first 70 years of liberalism, it was the Hamiltonian progressive tradition which really prevailed in most cases. That's why we had the TVA, but it's also why we had Robert McNamara and Robert Moses and all of these sort of the Jim Crow South, the powerful, oppressive, coercive, colonial things that progressives today look so derisively on. And so in the 1960s and the 1970s, the Jeffersonian progressive tradition began to find its level. And for the last 50 years, the beating heart of progressivism, the prevailing zeitgeist, has been how do we make it so that an oppressive, centralized authority above us does not oppress ordinary, powerless communities like Robert Moses did in the South Bronx. And so we can go through lots of examples, but the classic now is the Biden administration's effort to build electric vehicle chargers all around the country. They spent $7.5 billion, and that was 3 years before he left office. And for a whole variety of reasons, lots of hardworking people trying to work on it, there were so many roadblocks to them actually deploying the money that by the time he'd left office, only 58 chargers had been put online. $7.5 billion for 58 chargers. I'm not a math student, but that's not a great ratio. And in that kind of context, it's hard to imagine that ordinary Americans would want to invest in liberalism or believe that government could work. I believe that these two things can be rebalanced. I'm very bullish on that happening. I think we can talk more about it, but that I think is a focus and a lens for which we can understand the current problems and a reason for us to be bullish moving forward.
Thank you very much, Marc. Helena, now you have a very different perspective, partly because as the lost history of liberalism illustrates, there is a lot to the philosophy of liberalism that goes back. Some of it has been changing. Some of it has, some of the core remains with us, but it sort of paints this very jaded picture of all these sorts of ideas of liberalism. But there are also limits. Some people like John Gray, I think, would take issue with, Marc's, Josh's, and my optimism. So he says liberalism is dead, get used to it. So I think you also have some doubts as to how adaptive liberalism can be without some further rethink. So we would love to hear about that.
Well, great. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks all of you for listening. I think that we have different approaches to the way we study liberalism, although they're not necessarily in conflict. So for me, I'd just like to say that we talk about liberal democracy as if this is a given, and as if liberalism and democracy are complementary, natural allies. And this historically is incorrect. Democracy goes back to ancient Greece when it meant people power. And for 2,000 years or so, it was considered the worst form of government imaginable. I mean, how could you have the people exercising political power directly? Particularly in large countries, didn't even work, right? Liberalism, as a self-conscious movement, was really born in the 19th century, early 19th century. That's when the word was coined. That's when you have theorists discussing what liberalism stands for. And what did it, and there's a strong argument to be made, and I make it in my book, is that it was really, others have made it as well, that liberalism was really invented to contain democracy, to make it safe, to tame it. It stood for, in the very beginning, it stood for constitutional government, representative government, civil equality, the rule of law, and safeguards in place for the individual, such as freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom to buy and sell property. Civil equality was very, very important, but not political equality. Liberals were very wary of the masses. And there was reasons for this. So we're talking about 1812, 1814, when the cluster of ideas that we can refer to as early liberalism came together. That was in the wake of the French Revolution. And they had witnessed, these early liberals, the revolution and its derailment into terror. The early period was for them a wonderful period. That's when these concepts were put into place, the Constitution, the rule of law, and all these protections. But during the terror, it had derailed, and they had seen what they regarded as the irrational responses of the people, their uprisings, they're prone to violence, they don't even know their own interests, and in order to participate in government, you needed what they called capacity. You needed, and how do you get capacity? Is by having enough property in order to have the time to devote yourself, to educate yourself. You needed a certain amount of independence, so you wouldn't just vote the way your landlord or your boss told you to vote. And the time to dedicate yourself basically to thinking beyond your immediate needs, to think about the well-being of the whole country and not just your own selfish needs. So and the terror, by the way, there were many constitutions during the French Revolution, and the terror, there was the first democratic constitution, and that was the most violent period, the most bloody period of the revolution, the terror, when the famous guillotine. That's when thousands of people were executed. And Robespierre, the leader of the terror, famously made a speech where he said democracy depends on terror. Now, keep in mind that they have some different ideas of what democracy means. They're still really thinking of direct people power, not representative democracy, and not liberal democracy. They're still separate. The two only come together at the end of the 19th century. Liberalism and democracy, that's when we can start talking about a liberal democracy. Again, a way of making democracy safe, to keep the people from invading individual rights. So they saw the terror, and then they saw Napoleon. I would call him maybe the first populist leader. that we've seen them in modern times, who ruled by plebiscite, who started out, the liberals at first liked him, thought that he would bring peace to France and stabilize and protect the liberal accomplishments of the revolution. But he became a despot and a demagogue, and the people loved him. He was popular. He ruled by plebiscite, direct communication with the people, which is really what populism is, right? He said, I am the people. I know better than these representatives that you have. I don't need intermediate institutions to do what's best for the people. I know the people. I am, like I am the state kind of thing. And so this was one of the reasons why they had so little desire for democracy, so much fear or even sometimes disdain. And if you go across the 19th century, I mean, people like Tocqueville was very skeptical about democracy. John Stuart Mill was not for democracy. Therefore, civil equality. I want to make sure that they really believed in something like government of the best, government for the people, but not by the people. They expected a lot from the elites that they wanted to govern. Madame de Staël spoke of the government of the best. She didn't mean government of the richest. She meant it's idealistic, but she wanted the best to rule in favor of the people. They also believed that dismantling the feudal barriers that were in existence before the French Revolution, all the things that inhibited the economy from growing and kept the money in the hands of a few. They believed that once they got rid of those barriers, not only would wealth be created, but it would also be distributed quite naturally. And over time, liberals adapted, reinvented themselves. And I think I can talk about that more in the questions and answer period. But I think that liberalism has continuously reinvented itself, and so this is another moment. I think that it needs to reinvent itself in order to survive and deliver on its promise.
Thank you, Helena. That's very fascinating. I think it gives us a lot to sort of chew on in the rest. So we'll go do another round of follow-ups, and of course, please feel free to sort of respond to each other as well, but my questions will also follow that. But just to show my colors, I am a huge fan of Helena's book, but I do think, despite some tensions in my mind, there are two aspects of liberalism that is actually a fellow traveler with democracy. I mean, the first one, I think that if we take a slightly more expansive definition of individual liberty, especially like, for example, like the Republican thinkers, like Skinner, Pettit, etc., do, you have to have some say in the laws that apply to you, and that requires some degree of self-government. And I think the second, that if there is political liberty, which again liberalism always subscribes to, if you don't have any amount of self-government, then it's hollow. How can you say people are free to express their opinions and politically participate, but then take the power away from it? But the tensions are there, so that's why I think the reinvention is very, very important. I think Josh has thought a lot about these issues. But I want to hear from Josh on this, but also especially, how this populist era, which is so polarized, complicates your project, and how populist energy is channeled. I mean, if it's channeled like it is in the United States, are you still seeing the path to liberalism with populism?
So, 2 points. First, 3 points. First, on the issues about the relationship between liberalism and democracy, I was very careful in saying what I said, not to say that I was offering a definition of liberalism. There's a nice remark that Nietzsche made in the Genealogy of Morals, which I'll paraphrase this way. He essentially said, either an idea can have a definition or it can have a history. It can't have both. So I think much in the spirit of what Helena said, there's been an evolution in the understanding of these two ideas. So I was offering a particular interpretation for certain practical purposes first. Secondly, at a high-level point about the relationship between liberalism and democracy, I mean, there are some, starting from the, you were grabbing from the democracy end of the stick, I mean, there are some basic liberties of expression, association, for example, that are not limits on democracy. They're part of what it means to have a democracy in the first place. So they can't be, those liberties can't be up for grabs. There are others, more complicated, though I actually think in an odd way the same extends to religious liberty. So I think it's easy to overstate the tensions between liberalism and democracy rather than to see the two of them as having some kind of mutual playing some role in mutual interpretation. On the third point is, you know, I don't regard myself, I think there's a large difference between optimism and hope. I'm not particularly optimistic. I'm hopeful about the prospects for liberal democracy. And part of my hope comes from the fact that I think that a taproot of, as I said, a taproot of many of the animating concerns that have driven populism comes from people having entirely understandable, legitimate, lots of people, you, me, complaints, criticisms, righteous anger, righteous because it's justified. Justified by what? By the fact that opportunity has collapsed for lots of people. Justified by the fact that shared prosperity is honored more frequently in the breach. You know, Atif's comments on wealth inequality. I think one of the recommendations I have for the center is that you should establish the John Hobson Prize in Underconsumption Studies. There's a long tradition of, but when people complain about wealth inequality, well, are we supposed to dismiss that? Think that that's status anxiety? I don't think Atif is anxious about his status. It's an entirely legitimate complaint. And so I look in those sources of anger, hostility, often going in bad directions. But look, here's the last point. You raise these objections. You say, my community is falling apart. Our lives are terrible. And what you get are excuses. I mean, practically speaking, what you get are, yes, I understand, and you get excuses. That, I do think, has been the sad state of the Democratic Party in this country. People are waking up to that now. But anyway, my source of hope comes from thinking that the fundamental drivers of a bunch of populism come from people having a righteous anger directed to those failures. So it's like Lincoln in Cooper Union when he said that he had a kind of quiet confidence in the ultimate justice of the people. What better hope is there?
Thank you, Josh.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm very keen to hear from Marc and Helena, but are you just, your hope, is it more about activism or ideas?
Activism. No, I think these are ideas that have, it is ideas, but these are ideas that have to bring people together. And I do think that the activism that's going to really drive these ideas is an activism that's not going to come initially from a reconfiguration of the attitudes of leadership in the Democratic Party, but from them feeling pressured from below by people to do something about this. So it is activism.
Amen.
Yes.
Amen.
Yes.
Yeah. But now moving to Marc, I think you feel free to sort of touch on these topics, but I also wanted to hear from you sort of, which I think you have in the book, but you can expand on it for this audience, is what are the concrete steps for sort of rebalancing the Hamiltonian and the Jeffersonian impulses, given that we'll now live in such a polarized society that everything is going to create a lot of pushback from every group of activists, interest groups, businesses, community activists, organizers. So how are we going to do that? What are the concrete steps?
Yeah. Well, I think in stories. So let me start with a story. About a decade ago, Governor Charlie Baker here in Massachusetts signed a bill trying to green the grid. And he was going to replace fossil fuels in the Massachusetts grid by replacing oil and gas and whatnot with about half of it from wind turbines off the southern coast, about half from clean hydropower drawn down from Quebec. They have a bunch of dams up there and they had excess power. The problem, at least getting the power from Canada, was that they needed to get a transmission line down. And of course, Massachusetts doesn't border Canada, so that meant driving a transmission line down through New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. Originally, Baker cut a deal with the New Hampshire government, and everyone was all excited because Massachusetts was going to cover the cost and give New Hampshire some money, and it was going to be great. And then New Hampshire realized, well, north to south, that means going through across the White Mountains. And so New Hampshire, no. So then the governor of Maine realizes, oh, this could be a big boon for us. They'll give us money. It's Maine jobs. They'll give us some of the power. There'll be all sorts of benefits, and they go for it. And so they sign a deal, and the power company goes to those local communities, and they explain what they're going to do and the benefits they're going to get, and all that. Blah, blah, blah. Well, it's 10 years later, and we still haven't got the line. Why? And the reason is that there were all sorts of different mechanisms that progressives, I think liberals on this panel, that the liberals had created over the course of 50 years to make sure that a big power company couldn't come and jam a power line down a local community's throat. And there were all, if you read the story, it's chapter 8 of my book. Don't feel free to buy it, but if you want all the gory details, you can get them. At one point, right, there's the concern about there's an orchid species in the North Woods that's it's an endangered orchid species. I thought an orchid was a kind of bird. Turns out it's a flower. Who knew? This is an endangered species, so right there, the Army Corps gets involved. Just an incredible series of barriers they have to clear, and we still don't have that line available, meaning that this line, which would have the functional equivalent in terms of carbon emissions of eliminating 700,000 cars from Massachusetts roads every year, has not yet been completed. The question here is who gets to decide whether we build the line or not. Clearly, during the first 70 years of the 20th century, there would have been some sort of character, a Robert Moses character. It was David Lilienthal who ran the TVA. Here in Boston, there was a guy named Ed Logue who was built Government Center. There was a group here in Boston, I think, called the Vault. Right? Yeah. And they would have blessed it.
Or called that for a reason.
Yeah. I think they met in the vault, right? Yeah. These were powerful Hamiltonian institutions that made big decisions, and they made big decisions for good and for bad. And in the end, progressivism decided they made them for bad, so we changed it. We made it so that communities would no longer be paved over, ramrodded. Right? We created these. And so we made it so that almost anyone could say no for all sorts of good reasons, right? Like I don't know if you've been to Government Center, it ain't pretty, right? Right. Okay. So there was a reason. There was a reason that we did that. We can go back. We don't have to go all the way back to Robert Moses, but we can balance these two things. And the final thing I would say here is, at the turn of the 20th century, when the robber barons and machine politicians and the ward bosses were so powerful that we couldn't do anything collectively, right? Everything was corrupt. It was all Tammany Hall, and we had no powerful institutions. It was impossible to imagine that we could get a government powerful enough to solve big problems. 50 years later, we fixed it. Like we had Robert Moses and David Lilienthal and these huge public authorities and the Port Authority of New York and Ed Logue and all sorts of powerful institutions, the Social Security Commission, the New Deal, the Great Society, all this stuff. At that moment in 1968, during the convention, you looked all the people marching outside. I have a feeling of it. I don't know you well, but I bet you.
I wasn't there. I was occupying a building at Columbia.
Sometimes when I look like a duck. But in 1968, you had these powerful figures inside the Democratic Party who were inside the convention hall daily, right? These powerful figures, they seemed invincible to the people on the outside, right? It was almost impossible to imagine at any point there wouldn't be an establishment that would ramrod anyone who stood in their way. Here we are, a half century later, and we can't get Penn Station done. We can't get this transmission line done. We don't have high-speed rail. We don't have enough housing. We can't get things done. In each of these periods, it seems impossible that we will ever get to another version of liberalism, and we always have. So I say, at this moment, the reason that I'm both hopeful and optimistic is that even though it feels as though we can't do it, you saw Jake Auchincloss here. Like, there are others like him in Congress. There are new institutions being born. I'm part of one of them called Searchlight. There are a whole series of things that are happening. Some, in front of the cameras, some behind the scenes. I think that thinking is changing inside the academy. Things are happening to suggest that we are going to have a new version of liberalism that is going to push towards, you call it a liberalism that builds, abundance, supply side liberalism, you name it. People are pushing both in bipartisan ways and within the broad tent of the Democratic Party to make it so that liberalism delivers again, so that we're not fighting an uphill against Trump.
Thank you, Marc. That's great. Before I go to Helena, please feel free to line up for the Q&A, which we're going to start after Helena's turn. And I want to just say two things before I give the floor to you. The first one is, I think, I would love to hear your sort of response on liberalism and democracy, to the optimism or hopefulness that there is, but also more specifically, I agree with, I learned it from your book, I agree with your history, but you also said it, and I think it's in the nature of liberalism as a framework that it frequently reinvents itself. Why can't it reinvent itself that it is even more consistent with democracy? And in some sense, you agree with the rest of the panel.
I do indeed. We speak about the liberal crisis that we're going through, and it's real and scary. But liberalism was born in crisis. I mentioned earlier that it was really, when it came together as a movement and as a cluster of concepts, was in the French Revolution. I mean, an incredibly polarized situation, civil war, foreign wars, pretty much anarchy in the country. And it came together it really was conceived to solve these problems. And liberals were actually very pragmatic. They were centrists, they were gradualists. They did not want to go back to the pre-revolution. They didn't want revolution or reaction. They wanted slow reform in a certain direction. Now, jump to in 19th century with new problems, not just authoritarian rulers, but industrialization, new problems that arose. Pauperism, they called a new word invented in the cities. People stuck in poverty could not rise up as they had kind of thought that they would with the economy being liberalized. They thought, but they were seeing they're stuck in poverty, there's exploitation. At that point, liberals start saying, hey, we need to look at the social problem. We need to do stuff to help these people. We need to regulate. We need some distribution. We need factory hours and so on. And this thing in England called New Liberalism was invented. This is also when the libertarian wing detaches itself, because the libertarians say, no, stay the course. We haven't deregulated enough. And so there's these two liberalisms that happen. But just to say that they can reinvent themselves. And I do want to say one thing, which is I'm a little less optimistic about upward pressure. I find that, and I'm optimistic in the sense that I think liberals coming together, I agree there's signs in my academic world that things are, I think people are beginning to understand the need to kind of rethink themselves maybe, and there are centers around the country like this one and others that are discussing these issues. But I'm concerned about consumerism, widespread consumerism, and I'm concerned, of course, with AI and social media. And the congressman, the representative this morning, spoke about what it's actually doing to people's brains. And that is very, very concerning. Liberals from the very beginning were also very concerned with education, with self-improvement. They were moralists, the early ones. Oh, sorry. Liberalism, I'll say one more thing. Liberalism has, the root is liber. And liber, and goes back to Latin times, and it meant in Latin both freedom and generosity. It means, and that translates into toleration of others, and compassion. And I believe that these two concepts, freedom and generosity, over time have been, there's been new ways of expressing it, or the policies that go with it. So I'm hoping that there's a way that those can come together again. But last thing, Madame de Stael spoke about leaders more than she was hoping for good leaders. She was disappointed her whole life. And I'm just hoping that actually we do need a very good politicians to take the lead here.
Thank you, Helena. That's fantastic. And I have many more questions, but I'm hoping others in the audience do as well. Suzanne, please. Of course.
So my question is about the second term in the populist era. And I think if there's one that none of you have really talked about, the populist era, and if there's one fact about it is that it gets stuff done. The East Wing of the White House came down in short order, and presumably the new ballroom will go up in rapid order as well. And then turning to the second term, the definition of liberalism that both Josh and Marc provided was a liberalism which is basically responsive to anger, popular anger about things that should have been done, like more prosperity, more good communities, remaking Grand Central Station, and which weren't done. And it seems to me that it's extremely difficult to define liberalism in terms of those things that haven't been done in a populist era whose major characteristic is the overwhelming power of a ruler to get things done without any respect or any limitation. So I'd like to ask the panelists, what about the rule of law as it relates to liberalism? What about the idea that there needs to be some limits limits on what exactly government can do that intervenes in the life of private people. Is it acceptable if we think that there's too much illegal immigration, which I think most Americans actually do believe? Is it acceptable to have agents with masks plucking people off the street?
Thank you, Suzanne. Who wants to take that on?
I favor the rule of law. I mean, it's not and making light of a very serious issue. Thanks, Suzanne, for the question. My probably somewhat obscure remark about the relationship between protections of rights and democracy was intended to go to that issue. I don't think of the rule of law as a limitation on democracy. I think it's one of the things that makes democracy possible. And just to make the point more concrete, if you take some of the rights, I don't say this covers all, but if you take some of the rights that get rule of law protections, and I'll say again, rights of political participation, rights of freedom of expression, I think rights of religious liberty, rights of freedom of association. I don't regard those as limitations on what democracy is permitted to do. I regard keeping faith with those rights as part of what makes democracy possible. It does require limits on what the majority can do, but the majority can only serve as the tribune for the people under circumstances in which the people have a voice, and that means that you protect those rights. So, I mean, there's a longer story here, but I think I think of the rule of law as one of the elements that's required for democracy. And one last point. Let me preface this by saying Marc gave a kind of tepid advertisement for his book. I'll give a stronger one. It's a fantastic book. Everybody should read it. And if you have a choice between reading it and reading another book that's gotten a lot of play, the one by Ezra and Derek, I'd say read his. It's a much richer and more interesting book. But I don't think that the case for liberalism or liberal democracy is principally that it's capable of getting things done. I think it has to get things done in order to be sustainable. But I think of the case for it as being more intrinsic. It's a way of treating people as equals with the respect and concern to which they're entitled. And then the challenge for liberalism or liberal democracy, is to make sure that keeping faith with those values is consistent with getting things done. If some other order is better able to get things done, but is miserable in other respects, why? I think that democracy is to be favored, but it can't fail on getting things done. There's some threshold level that it needs to have.
I agree with everything, including the advertisements for Marc's book, but Marc wants to come in.
Well, you called it a tepid endorsement of my own book. I will say that I just handed in the foreword to the paperback edition, and it addresses this very point. Yeah. So I would urge you both to buy the hardcover and the paperback. Yeah. Okay, now you're more full-throated. That's good.
My
answer to that is that we've got a continuum here, where we've got one person who makes all the decisions and a rule of law that makes it impossible to do anything. And we on the liberal spectrum have gone so far to the end of the spectrum where you can't build this transmission line that makes so much sense from Quebec to Massachusetts. You can't build high-speed rail, you can't build enough housing, you can't do this, you can't do that. That spurs ordinary people who want government to work into the populist camp. That we did this to ourselves. If you want to stop Trump, eliminate the sowing the seeds of populism by making government properly balance individual rights and the will of the many. because there needs to be some way to be able to come to some sort of conclusion. The problem is that since the 1960s, 70s, Congressman Auchincloss mentioned the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, passed in 1970. It was supposed to basically be that highway engineers passed each other in a hallway, said, is there some less destructive way to build that highway? I don't know. All right. Right? That was basically what the law, it was meant to be a nothing burger. Because it was combined in very thoughtful and savvy ways by lawyers in the ilk of Ralph Nader and PERG and the various environmental groups who combined it with the Administrative Procedures Act and whatnot, they made it so that now, I mean, you can't touch a blade of grass in a public park without going through just incredible amount of process, which makes it impossible to get things done, which frustrates voters. I'm not saying we shouldn't have any process. We should consider what the impacts are going to be on endangered species, and whether we're going through a tribal land, and whether we're going to change the quality of the water. But like, government is making hard value judgments. Is it worth it to go through someone's farm if we're going to build a high-speed rail that takes a lot of people off the road so we have fewer emissions? That person has lost his or her farm. Lots of people are off the roads. That's a subjective judgment that government in its present incarnation cannot make. It can't make trade-offs. It's all process and legal. We need to get back, not to a place where Robert Moses makes that judgment entirely on his own, on a whim, in his pajamas. But we do need a place where government is able to take different policy goals and come to a conclusion, not so that overnight the East Wing is gone, but so that thoughtful people trying to do the right thing can come to a conclusion whereby at some point in a reasonable amount of time, people can see progress in their lives and they don't have to go to some madman in search of progress.
Thank you, Marc. We have now 2 minutes left, so what I'm going to do is 30-second, 2 questions. I'm going to take them and then give 1 minute to each panelists for last thoughts, including perhaps reactions to these 2 30-second questions. But 30 seconds, otherwise I'm going to cut you guys off.
Okay. So I have a more pessimistic view. I think, like, if you especially think of a third world, if I have like next to nothing savings rate and I have no savings, why, like, all my life decisions have led me to this moment where I have no savings rate, I can barely feed my family. And then if you tell these people that you have more value, your thinking matters, why? I mean, the response, I mean, at least what I've gotten is, there's this, you're coming from a position of power, from position of privilege. That's where I think liberalism at least comes from. And you're feeding information, hey, even if you think this XYZ politician is not as good as you think, you're feeding information in my mouth. And he's done something in his life, whether he's corrupt or not. So why should I listen to myself rather than him, who's actually done something?
Okay, Nathan, 30 seconds.
Yeah, my question was just to Josh, how you handle the sources of anger that are like not righteous. So like Arlie Hochschild's story of feeling like black people cut in line to get economic opportunity in sort of your framework and the marriage between liberalism and populism.
All right, let's start from Helena. And then, okay. Well,
yeah, no,
unless you're ready.
Yeah, no, I'm fine. I'm just not sure I can answer those questions. But I did want to say, what we have, I don't know about a populist era, but we certainly have an illiberal government right now. Rule of law is essential to liberalism, balance of power, freedom of the press, and all the things I mentioned before. I mean, those are just critical. And the whole point was to limit the power of an authoritarian ruler. And also, I'm keen on the moral angle. There was a belief that you needed a moral and a respectable, high-minded kind of leader that people could look up to. And unfortunately, that is not the case.
Thank you, Helena. 60 seconds, Marc. Final thoughts.
The questions were too good for me to be that quick. I'm gonna leave it to Josh.
Okay, then I'll take 2 minutes. I'll borrow one of yours.
That's liberalism right there.
Yeah. It's a wonderful question, Nathan, and I don't. My offhand answer to it is that I would rather be dealing with people who don't have righteous sources of anger by first joining together with people whose sources of anger do. Kind of makes the problem more politically tractable, I think. I'm just counting numbers. If you get what I mean. Power matters too. So, and on the issue, this other issue, I'm going to answer. It's probably different from the question that was asked. It's in the neighborhood, and it's one that I think I can answer. So, and it comes back to something that Atif said. I think it's rightly remembering that he wasn't dealing with the international aspect of the problem. I think part of reconfigured liberalism needs to address the fact that the over-savings / underconsumption issue is not just an issue in the United States. It's a global issue, and I'm in the spirit of the Pettis-Klein trade wars, class wars, I think I hate liberal imperialism, but I don't mind saying that living standards in places that have a huge amount of savings and that are driving trade conflicts that maybe there should be some increase in domestic consumption in those places.
Thank you, Josh. I believe I speak for others as well that we could listen to Helena, Marc, and Josh for longer, but this is our session's end. Thank you very much for this fantastic session. And,